Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Payment Hub Expansion. This is Brian from Strategic Treasurer, and we're pleased you could join us as we discuss the growth and challenges of payment complexity and solutions that can help. Our speakers for today are Michael Kolman, Chief Product Officer at Ion Treasury, and Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner of Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Michael and Craig, and I'll now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here, spending a little bit of time with Michael and I, talking about payment hub expansion, how that's becoming increasingly important in this era of growing complexity around payments. Michael, so glad you could join me today.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Glad for everybody to join as well.
Or I'm glad to join you. However we phrase that would be perfect. But we've got a lot to cover, so thanks everyone for paying attention. So as Brian had mentioned, there's going to be some poll questions. But let's go through what our agenda is. What are we going to talk through today and cover? We'll begin with payments complexity. And there's a number of factors that add to complexity that drive people to the point of needing a payment hub. If you're making payments from one place, one bank, in one form, in one type of transmission, that's definitely different than using 15 different originating systems in different currencies, 2 different banks with different formats, different payment rails. So the complexity can go from 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 to something more complex. We'll go through a view of complexity to help you understand that. So not everyone needs a payment hub. Not everyone needs a jet to get around. Sometimes those complexity factors vary. Then we'll jump over briefly onto staffing and technology. So this is the context of your corporation and treasury. If you are a small organization, maybe you're in treasury, maybe there is no treasury group. That may differ. You may be under-resourced in payments or a very small organization getting going. Or maybe you have a more mature area and Treasury is taking on the role of the superintendent of payments seriously. And so your ability to resource staff and look at payments will vary as well. That factors into the other elements of complexity that we'll talk about. And then when we touch on Payment Hub, what is it? How can it help? Michael will spend most of the time talking about how this can be a simplifying factor for some of the complexities that we see. And so it's very useful to understand those complexifying factors, if that's a word, as well as the simplifying factors and what a payment hub does. Then we'll examine solutions. What are the capabilities that exist? What are your needs? Your needs likely stem in the areas of efficiency, control, ability to scale. What does the vendor do? How does it help your product or your solution grow in value over time or remain dormant? So quite a bit to cover there. And then we'll look at moving towards simplicity. Where are you in the continuum of needing complexity? When is the upgrade to newer or more complete technology appropriate? When is it required? So we can think about those. And then finally, if I can finish this overview slide out without taking 5 minutes, is what are the key takeaways? Michael and I will talk about complexity, fraud and control, scalability and sustainability, as well as some of those evaluation factors to wrap up our discussion at the end, to leave it with you. So I know that was a lot of an overview. So Michael, now we can get into the details. Tell us about payment complexity. What are some of these elements of payment complexity?
Yeah, I'll try to work in the word complexifying. I think everybody on the webinar can say I was there when this word was invented, but I'll do my best. So on this slide, it does a nice job of really laying out a number of drivers of complexity around payments specifically. And I think at first, really, I think to say that complexity isn't stagnant, it's probably pretty obvious. But many of these items are going to grow in conjunction with the overall growth of your your business expansion, whether that be organic growth or through M&A activity. Really, as the business grows, just generally, if you're a smaller company and your credit needs are increasing, and as a result, your bank group is increasing, you might wind up with a larger number of banks that you have dealt with in the past. So entering new markets, new geographies, this is hugely significant. You're going to be adding new banks, new bank accounts. You're going to be then engaging in potentially new message formats and new payment rails. You're going to have to establish new bank connections. New payment types will arise. As you go, more and more global, you have multiple cutoff times to deal with in every country or region, and holiday calendars to contend with. And M&A activity really overnight can change that, where you inherit a number of banks and formats and source systems, and then accessing the accounts may vary. So how you actually access payments, and the various different systems exist, who have multiple formats, and those formats then depend on bank specific formats. And so as you can see, this can just explode in complexity, and maybe you all have experienced some of these drivers, and you've seen complexity grow in your organizations, or maybe you're trending toward somewhat of a more complex state. So the question ultimately becomes, when complexity increases, do you have the capacity to scale? And we've talked here specifically on this slide and the points raised here about complexity specific to payments, but also just as critical are the impacts on other processes that rely on payment activity. So will you still be able to continue and maintain an accurate cash position and overall visibility to your cash and a cash forecast? Will you be able to ensure that any expected payments were actually made, and or more importantly, maybe unexpected payments were not? So that the concept of bank reconciliation playing in here. So I think it's not just specific to payments, but those complementary processes in just a broader cash management perspective. So in the next slide, we'll compare sort of relative complexity based on a number of these factors, and I'll hand it off to Craig to cover that.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. As we look at this chart, this can be confusing. So I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it. Michael went through a bunch of those complicating factors or complexifying factors, if you like. What areas originate payments? Accounts payable, there might be multiple areas. You might have payroll, admin systems. If you look across the screen, then you have the payment systems, like three AP systems for one AP area, or three AP systems and three AP areas would each factor into this chart. But as we go across the x-axis here, I think it'll help you understand, if we start up with this final sample score up in the right to 18, that's a sample score, and that factors into this chart where these score ranges end. I just want to use this as here's a context for that. So 18 would fall in the moderate. And so whatever your score is going to place you somewhere on this range of simple, moderate, complex, highly complex, or hyper complex. And the reason for this is to look at it and say, if your score tends to be low, let's say below 14, you don't need a payment hub. And if it's hyper complex, you're well past the point of needing one. You want to get moving. But by the time you fall into the complex factor, you really should use a payment hub or consider a payment hub. This moderate level means if you're growing, maybe that's something you need to put on the roadmap to evaluate when you might need that. And so that's just a way of calibrating what your need is. So that's the end point of that. So this factor, you can see I forgot how you described it when we talked the other day, the check boxes. What was the phrase you used? You used something like It was like anyway, the gray sections are filled in. So if you have 3 to 4 areas that originate payments, that would be a 2. If you have 3 to 4 systems, that would be a 3 on this scale. 2 payment types, maybe check and ACH or ACH and wire or BACS and SEPA, whatever those are. Payment formats, ISO 20022, maybe an MT101, maybe NACHA, some of the different formats. How many banks you have, how many currencies, how many countries you're in. All of those, if you add up the numbers on the left, 2, 3, 1, 2, and those who love math have already added up and come up with 15. And then there's a factor of, is your complexity decreasing? Is it remaining constant, increasing, or increasing rapidly? That's a factor to say, we're acquiring companies, we're going into new markets, we're adding our complexity at a greater rate. And so this is just a way of factoring that. So in this particular situation, we see that it was times 1.2, so it comes up with 18. But in your particular situation, you may have some different scores. And this is useful, and this is a conceptual diagram. A little more review is needed, but this gets you to the concept of how complex are you in your business? How is that changing? And do you need one? Will you need one soon? Or are you at that point of evaluating? So someone using QuickBooks, only issuing ACH to one bank in one currency, does not need to look at a payment hub. And this is kind of like the question about benchmarking. When people are comparing, how do we compare to other companies? And if you just use one factor like size of a company, a $3 billion company, if they have almost only 1 or 2 customers, they get a few wires in a month, they get $250,000 in a month, they're 3 billion, but that's super simple on the AR side. And so they need one of the most simple systems for receiving those funds. As an example, they could be far more simple or less complicated than a $200 million company that has 1,000 customers remitting payments from many, many choices, from many places, many currencies. Now, that's not exactly a payment hub, but that's the concept of there are different factors that add to complexity around payments. And so this is a way of showing that. Michael, can you rescue me from that complex explanation of simplifying complexity?
I think, yeah, I'll do my best. I think that hopefully this matrix is sort of a useful way to contextualize the complexity. I mean, I think we often use the word complexity, but don't necessarily put it into context as to, well, what does it mean? Like in your organizations, you might feel something is complex, but in the grand scheme of things, maybe it isn't. And also complexity could be, short term, and not saying that a payment hub is the solution to everything. So for example, there might be some M&A activity in your organization where you acquire another company, and that company is actually in the exact same country as you, right? So the number of countries hasn't necessarily exploded in complexity. It's still the same. In fact, they might even use the same banks as you. Or let's say they use different banks as you. Is the solution to really throw on a payment hub because you're high in one of these columns? The answer is probably not always, right? There are other ways to handle that complexity in terms of bank consolidation, rationalization, and that might be more strategic than putting a system in place. So this is just a good way to directionally think about the problem. But as Craig explained, as you become more and more complex really across the page here, the opportunity to be able to scale and control your payment ecosystem becomes much more challenging and could result in a need for a payment hub.
Thanks for the save. I appreciate that. And the other factor is payment formats are changing. There's some payment formats are going away. There's a lot of activity that is not even captured on this chart, which has to be considered by most organizations. Well, excellent. That brings us to staff and technological complexity as well. I had mentioned earlier, if your organization is a bit more mature, there's a developed and defined role. Treasury is the owner of cash. They're the superintendent of payments, the lead for financial risk management. If they have those definitions carved out, which helps them decide, which helps you decide what you do and what other areas do, you're going to be farther along in this process. But there's a lot of treasury groups that are extraordinarily small, billion-dollar companies with 2 or 3 people. It can be very small. And so where your organization sits in the development cycle can make a difference. But that's part of the process too. We believe, Strategic Treasury believes, that every treasury group is the superintendent of payments. Not that they have to do every payment, but they are just like a superintendent responsible for making sure that there's teachers, people that clean the hallways, the safety officers, the people that transport kids with buses, everything else that goes into whatever that example is for schools, takes place, including security and payment security. They're certainly the superintendent of payment security, though they're not IT security. And so this is just a way of showing, a change in where your organization is. You may not get to, be at the complex level or the staff level, but just understanding that there's a difference there can factor in what you might be able to accomplish in the next year or 2 or 3 years. So the left side is the treasurer and the manager or treasury manager. Treasurer is doing strategic activities, relationships, debt, capital markets. The manager is setting the cash position, forecasting, may need a range of tools from a treasury management system, but may not be able to add a payment hub with that type of organizational structure, even if the rest of the organization is complex. At the same time, other organizations may have the breakout between, in this organization, 3 assistant treasurers or directors covering the debt, capital markets, and risk, international treasury in this case, and then domestic treasury and payments. There's numerous charts and examples, but as you move between these 2, as you move towards the right, organizations have the bandwidth and the capacity to take on that role that is theirs of superintendent of payments. Michael, would love some of your comments on this one too.
Yeah, no, I just when I first was staring at this chart and I saw sort of the left-hand side to the right-hand side, I thought to myself, well, these are just what the right-hand side is showing is sort of just almost like it's really the treasury organization, and so what you don't see behind that is the execution arm and the other parts of the business. So there's even more complexity that Treasury is managing because, as Craig said, the superintendent of payments, right, setting the policy, not necessarily the execution, but you've got the AP and the AR teams, you've got your tax function, your payroll function, so there's the business units have their own specific needs, and Treasury in a lot of ways has the ability to gain that visibility, to centralize, to become a bit more in control of the payments, not just setting the policy. So it does become quite complicated within the organization. And then somebody also has to lead new initiatives. So as a payment message format changes, for example, who's going to be the delivery of that message to the rest of the organization, letting them know that all the source systems need to make updates? I think that's sort of the role that Treasury plays. And just on the chart here, just within Treasury, there's a lot to communicate, but throughout the organization, it's just enormous.
Yeah, thanks. I see some good chats going on and some questions coming in, but this brings us to our first poll question. So let me get that set up for us. So there's some notes in the chat box about how to find the poll question if you don't see it. Some companies block these pop-up polls and quizzes, but there's some instructions there to do it. This is a select all that apply. This is our first poll question. It's on banking complexity. So who's on the call today? Our banking complexity situation is, we issue payments out of 3 or more banks. We use 10 or more banks. We make payments in this many currencies or countries. Go down the list and select all that apply. Now, if you don't know, it's not applicable. There's also a section for we're a Treasury tech provider, bank, or consultancy. But on the first section, see what you can answer, then hit submit. We'll give everybody a moment or so. We have very healthy attendance. We are just shy of 400, barely. So I'm going to say let's just say 200 people need to type the word ION, ION, or hub. Either one, you can type that in the chat box. And if we get 200, we will go ahead and share all the results of the polling questions with you when everything's sent out within a week. That's just a way of doing it. So pretty good. Look at that. Hub, ION, it's quite a bit. That's a simple name for a company, Michael, so it's pretty easy. But while that's going on, I'm going to take and I see people are typing into the Q&A box too, but that's fine. Brian can count those up wherever you type them. That's awesome. There's a question: is there a difference between the terms payment factoring and payment hub? And here's what I would say. I would start this off as you can find payment factoring and payment hub defined differently on the internet. What we saw when we researched this before and what we settled on is that payment hub is the technology that can generate payment files, manage the confirmation process, and send it out. It's the technology. We define payment factory as the group or the area that handles payments, so the center of excellence that handles payments. And that may include a payment hub and may include the technology. So that's how we define it. That the majority of definitions would follow along with that, and that's how we put it in our analyst report. But there's certainly quite a bit of evidence to the contrary as well. Do you define it any differently?
I've also, it's a great question, and I'm not sure that there's a clear answer. I can tell you that we refer at ION to it as payment hub, and primarily because we had functionality we called payment factory before, and that was mainly to be able to take in payments, process those payments, go through the workflow, which I think are all aspects of the payment hub, but I think the payment hub is even broader than that. And I think just the word hub, I haven't Googled the definition of hub, but if you just think about a hub for your laptop connections, right? It's a place to plug in a number of different devices all in one place, right? And I think the payment hub, it's the same type of concept, right? We're plugging in a number of different source systems to essentially be able to bring everything to a central connection point.
Excellent, thank you. So we have our answers up. Perfect timing. So Michael, as I look at these, I see quite a few complicating factors or complexifying factors, if you like the new term. 30% see it's increasing in their organization. Almost 40% issue payments out of 3 or more banks. Any other thoughts on this? This just looks like those are pretty good numbers considering we have about 30% work for a bank or a Treasury tech provider or consultancy that wouldn't be applicable. So, out of 70%, those are pretty big numbers here.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, the question on issuing payments out of 3 or more banks. From research that we've done, we see that most companies, you can capture 80 to 90% of transactions probably through 3 to 5 different banks. So even in a high complexity state, even if you have a small number of banks, I think that's more around bank strategy. But what you don't know is that you might have 30 different source systems that are making payments from that bank, and that just explodes the complexity. And maybe that requires 30 different connections or access to so many people for bank portals. So there's really a lot behind sort of the surface here. But this is, I think we've got a good group here where things are becoming complex or already there.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that explanation and for everybody for answering. So in the chat box, you'll see a note for following ION on LinkedIn. and also Strategic Treasury. We encourage you to click on that, follow it. That makes our marketing teams really happy. And if you make them happy, it makes us be a lot happier too. So it's really good if you would go ahead and do that if you're not already following. So thanks for that. And then Michael, as you described it as a hub, like you plug everything in. This looks like there's two plugs, but we've simplified things by putting them in two containers around the payment hub. Maybe you could talk us through what is a payment hub.
Yeah, I think the picture is great. Picture's worth 1,000 words, and the hub, as you know, as I was saying, it really does provide and enable centralization of payment activity, and all the processes that make that up. So for companies, you see on the left-hand side, right, where you have many source systems, including multiple ERPs, we've run into companies that have actually over 80 different ERP systems. I mean, most of this growth comes because of acquisitions, right? You acquire, and the businesses are so complex within their own right, it doesn't necessarily make sense to try and consolidate the ERPs. So you wind up with a lot of different ERP systems. You have tax systems, you have your payroll, and the payment hub, and your treasury system, of course, and your the payment hub really brings these the payments together. And I just mentioned, from a connectivity standpoint, each one may not have any connectivity direct to the bank. So what we've also seen are some systems that are used in certain countries might be different. And while Treasury sets the policy, right? So the policy might be how many people need to approve a payment before it can be released to the bank. And that might vary based on the amount. It might vary based on the country it's being made to. It can be the type of payment, whether it's a one-off payment, and to ensure that the policy is you're compliant with the policy. Some of those source systems don't necessarily have the workflow capability to ensure that compliance. So the payment hub has that flexibility, and it has the logic to be able to compensate where source systems might not have the capability, or act more as a centralization, in some cases a pass-through, so that you can connect directly to your banks. So I think that this is one thing that comes up pretty much all the time is really around improving security and controls, and removing the need for so many people to access the bank portal, which might have a cost to it, but also more importantly has a security risk, right? Bank portals are not typically tied into your company's access directory, identity manager, and so if there's movement in the organization, you really have to make sure that you're updating those bank portals, whereas a payment hub can link directly, single sign-on can link to your access directory, and make sure that you are always, your security, your user access is always current. So I think that one driver, we talk about complexity, but a massive driver of the payment hub really is around controls. So the ability to centralize not just the payment activity, and the bank connectivity, but also the ability to then layer on some additional services. So I think we've all experienced that while there are message standards out there, nothing's truly standard, right? To send a message, whether that be, pane 001 message, it's not always the same. It depends on what bank you're sending it to and what geography. So there's transformation of those messages, and the logic of those transformation messages should be centralized rather than recreated in a number of different sources. The ability also to then layer on services such as fraud controls. So if you're doing any sort of account validation checking, or now we've got the capability using machine learning to look for payment anomalies. Those services are really difficult to layer on if all the payment activity is scattered in a number of different places. So what we've certainly seen is scalability is a reason, but improved security is another big reason and a big benefit of the payment hub here. So it really is the ability to centralize that activity into a common hub, apply consistent services, and be able to centralize all of your bank connectivity. And this is not just to send payments out, but also to collect statements as well. Payment Hub can also work directionally from right to left, as we've talked about, but also from left to right. So those bank statements coming back can go through the Payment Hub, where the Payment Hub can be used as a distributor of those bank statements back to the systems that might need them, which reduces the amount of times you are paying, let's say, to access bank statements through your banks. So there could be a cost benefit as well. Craig, do you want to add anything else that I may have missed?
I thought that was great. I would only say something of a term that we use. So when you take the information back into the Payment Hub, we call that the Payment Hub and the information consolidation, a Treasury aggregator, doing both ways. So that's just how we define the terms. But I really liked how you were describing that and the differences that exist in organizations. So excellent. Yeah, so let's go to our second poll question. This is a long poll question. It's multiple choice again. And this goes to what Michael talked about with regard to fraud. And I do want to make another comment on that after I describe this. So in the last 12 months, in the last year, our organization experienced the following fraud: attempts or losses. Attempts or losses. Check forgery, social engineering, all the way down to ransomware, data encryption, attempts or losses, and then no known attempts or losses. And so this would be, what are you aware of that has happened? And so answer, select all that apply, and then hit submit, and we'll be good. So with my challenge to have 200 people type the word ION poll or hub, we had needed 50 more after the first time. I think we're down to probably about 30. So once we get 200, you guys are typing fast, which is good. Look at ION Hub. Look at that. There's combination. That only counts as one, though. We're not giving double count for that. But I'm interested to see what are some of the top ones here.
And we're not allowed to contribute, Craig, so we can't even bias the results here.
No. Well, we could bias them by saying comments on the front end, but not from voting. Yeah, blocks us from voting. What are we? Chopped liver? So we have enough. There's been enough responses. So thank you, everybody, for pushing that in. I know we like, Michael and I both like data. This is a lot of data to see it live. Those that are interested in learning about payment hubs, we have the answers now for what's been the experience with fraud for those that are here. And one thing, as you were talking about that as being one of the leading drivers of using payment hubs is security. That makes sense because, not every organization is adding complexity or complicating factors at the same rate. And so scale may not matter there as much, but everyone's being attacked by criminals. They're more sophisticated. They're rolling out more organizations. And so that makes sense that that's becoming more important over time because everyone's facing that issue. But maybe we can see the results of the polls and quizzes as they've come in. For those of you who are tuned in to countries that are not the United States or those with almost no checks or no checks at all, 58% identify that's happened here. That's what happens. But look across the board, Michael. Social engineering by phone, email, or text all the time. Business email, we receive emails every single day. I get to look and see everything that gets caught by the filters and the ones that get through the filters. There's dozens a day that you can see if you go talk to your IT people. Any thoughts or comments about this? This really speaks to your point about the level of security.
I think that I mean, one thing that we've seen in research that we've done on payment fraud, I think I can't remember who published this. It may have been from the AFP, but it was a huge number. Over 80% of companies have experienced fraud in the last 12 months. That's just massive, just a massive number. I also, maybe it's just me and I'm showing my age here, but I grew up in an era where fraud was largely internal. And what the research we've done showed is that's no longer the case. And this just little poll here sort of confirmed that, right? Only 10% of people who responded here looked like they had experienced internal or employee fraud. So that's interesting. And I think that the world has changed, and social engineering and the focus on cybersecurity, it's real. And I think it has become a huge factor. I mean, I would imagine if a poll question we put out there was, has your company provided training around preventing cybersecurity intrusions? I would imagine 100% of us probably say yes. So I think the high amount of social engineering, I mean, we see it. I think all of us probably see it, whether it be tests from our IT teams that are just testing whether or not we're paying attention, or it's actual real social engineering. It is a huge area of focus, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, for banks, it is essentially 100%. Every single bank does that cybersecurity training, and the vast majority of corporations do it. It's not quite 90%. And then if you ask further about payment security training, that number dips down to around 50%. So certainly a lot of room to grow. But the length of time of cybersecurity has caused some good reactions there. Thanks again for your comments.
I think that I would just say, I would just also just add one last thing, which is I don't think it's surprising to many that the numbers around fraud are so significant, because I think also there's a number of compensating controls that have been put in place. You add a new counterparty, you change settlement instructions, you're probably doing callbacks to validate that data. So there are processes that have been put in place in order to help mitigate any of that risk, but the amount of time that's being spent on callbacks is leading to some new emerging technologies which can help provide the same level of prevention, but maybe save a bunch of time and scale. And it all goes back to sort of the same concept of, if things are decentralized, it becomes much more difficult to really apply the same concepts. So, as we move to this next slide on keeping current, I looked at the left-hand side and I started to think, what in this concept of everything is sort of scattered all over the place. I started to think about the card game, 52 card pickup. If anybody is familiar with that, you throw the cards up in the air and they just go everywhere. And it's not really a game. It's it's more annoying than anything else. But little kids love it, and you can do it with them. And so then everyone's picking up all the cards ultimately to get them back into a deck, because the only game you can play when they're scattered all around is that 52 card pickup. So it's sort of the same concept here on this chart. If payment activity is scattered all over the place, it's really hard to then do anything with it, to then apply new norms, to take advantage of new opportunities, new technologies. And so setting the right foundation is really critical, I think, to scaling. And I think that's what this chart here is trying to demonstrate. And so if we just take an example, a real life example of what all of us are starting to face right now, which is this transition to ISO 20022 standards. So if some of you may have already started to receive some notifications from your banks, but with all of the new payment initiatives around the world, there's different times when all become effective. But in 2025, the banks are mandated now to in the US in 2025 will be mandated to um, retire old messages and use the new ISO standards. So if you guys aren't familiar with this, it's something to certainly pay attention to. And as a result, when the banks have to comply with these new standards, they then will turn around and push those standards down to you. So even though there's no regulatory compliance on corporates, there's an indirect impact because the banks will likely turn around and, since they require information in a certain format, require you to provide that information in that format. So we've certainly seen some notifications after a certain date. The banks will no longer accept data without the structured format. So ISO, the big change in the latest version of ISO 20022 is that there's very structured name and address fields that you need to comply with. And that means changing that across all of your various source systems, then getting that into the right message format so that can then be sent to the bank. And so it goes back to a comment I made earlier. Well, who's responsible for this in the organization? In a lot of cases, the banks aren't notifying you that you need to actually make these changes. So where does it sit? And I think Treasury representatives have been sort of plugged into this and are taking on the responsibility of making sure that everyone in the organization is up to speed. And so if we go back to my 52 card pickup, Treasury is almost taking the responsibility to make sure all 52 cards are picked up, making sure everybody knows what needs to change with ISO, making sure all systems are updated and all messages are updated. And I think that's just the role that I've seen Treasury playing across organizations I've been working with. But it goes, once again, it's the foundation. It needs to be easy to do things like BAU. So it's not just ISO transition doesn't come up every day, but adding new banks, adding new payment types, reporting on new accounts. These are things that come up quite often. Having a solution for new payment rails. So this is actually, there's a lot of new payment initiatives that are out there, and the ability to make payments, cross-border, especially faster and easier, there's just so much opportunity that is really coming about, that as you explore new opportunities, the ability to pivot is opened up when you have that solid foundation. And we already talked a lot about fraud, but one area we didn't talk about is sanctions. Right. So I think sanctions have become a really popular foreign policy tool and means when it comes to payments, the question is, well, how do you manage that? And you might say, well, it's only the responsibility of the banks to enforce the compliance. And while the banks do the sanction checking, if something were to come up at that point in time, it could delay payment to a critical supplier when you could be doing a sanction check earlier in your workflow. So the responsibility actually, I think, has shifted over the years to making sure that that corporates actually have the ability to do sanction screening as well, especially be able to respond quickly as governments lay on new sanctions. Craig, do you want to add anything there that I may have missed?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you were talking about, I would just emphasize again this idea of you need more address information. That's becoming, you hear it country by country, they need more information, and even though the format may have a place for it, you may not even have those fields in the underlying system. So you've got to address those requirements as they emerge over time and handle that instead of repeating it. Like in this case, it looks like you'd be repeating it, I don't know, 15 times. Find ways to simplify that activity. Yeah, so thank you. A lot of people are saying we want a third poll question, and we are providing that as well. So, what would be a key driver for your organization to use a payment hub? The top response is we already use one, and then there's the other responses there: fraud protection, efficiency, and scalability, keeping up with new payment rails, new format requirements, managing complexity, or not applicable. So that's the third question. And I'll ask Brian to post. We have enough of the ions and hub in the chat box. I'll ask him to post the LinkedIn links there as well, and nobody else needs to respond in the chat box there. Give everybody just a moment.
Yeah, and Craig, I guess just maybe one comment we haven't actually touched on. Surprisingly, this is 45 minutes into a webinar and nobody's mentioned anything about AI. But that's another benefit actually as well that we haven't touched on. So those of us who think about ourselves as digital organizations, or you're becoming more of a digital organization, it's all about the data, right? Data is really hard to get when it's scattered all over the place and it's not consistent and the quality is low. And so that is an opportunity here as well when it comes to payments and being able to potentially use AI to generate forecasts when you have all of your payment history all in one place. So there are some advantages as well. ISO 20022, we say it's a transition that we're being forced to take on, but at the same time, you can see it as an opportunity because your bank messages can actually now contain more useful information that you can then do something with it. So there is really a tremendous opportunity, but it goes back to setting the right foundation. And those who really think of themselves as digital organizations, you're constantly thinking about how do I capture the data properly? And I think that those companies do have an advantage, especially when it comes to scalability.
Excellent. And so the responses here, 23%, just about a quarter already use one. And between those two, efficiency and scalability and fraud protection, efficiency and scalability is edging out. So maybe the majority of those who already used one did it primarily for the fraud protection, but you can see some of those drivers. The lowest one we have, besides not applicable, is keeping up with payment rails and then complying with new requirements. And those are becoming bigger issues, as we get closer to cutoffs and the extinguishment of some other formats that exist. Anything else on any other comments on the drivers, Michael?
No, I think this is great.
Thanks everybody for responding. So the next couple of images and content that we're going to share, I'll start off and Michael will add some comments. But when you look at examining a solution, a technology solution for a payment hub doesn't come in isolation. And so, what do we look at? Certainly companies look at vendor strength, and that's traditional, always the case. I would also say it has to do with the concentration of the vendor's focus. Is our payment hubs, treasury systems, the core focus, or is it the fifth of five in terms of what they're investing in? So vendor strength matters. The other aspect too, as we look across the board here, it's on future proofing. It's also on the value of systems that you acquire or you license. Is the system you get, is that going to improve in value? Is it an asset that increases in value over time? Is it being updated? Is it handling the complexity? Is it adding benefits, features that you need over time? I think those are other factors to consider when you look at examining a solution, because you're trying to address complexity that exists today and that you're reaching for, but there's other elements that may arise that you don't anticipate. So those are a couple of the factors that touch on vendor strength and future proofing. I think a couple other ones, the experience, the ability to integrate as a concept of a hub, as Michael talked about. You have the left side where things like ERPs, how you connect to ERPs or underlying systems, as well as banks. And whether you're doing that through a file transfer process or you're moving more towards streaming internally, are you connecting externally via APIs or API gateways, handling the integration and connectivity methods is also vital. You have to look at where things are going. Things are moving more towards APIs, but you have to support other connection methods as well. As we experience this somewhat drawn out process of moving from one type of tech to another, it's usually we add technology and then one technology dwindles over time. Those are a few of the things that I would start off with, Mike. I'll let you jump in if you'd like to.
I think I agree. There's also just this consideration of speed to comply or speed to adapt. Right. So as payments are a pretty critical function, right? When you have payment due, it has to get made. And so the ability to respond, and I think that this comes up many times when you have so many demands on your ERP that how quickly can you get in line for the updates that you need? And this is a critical function. It's just a bit of a specialization. And so I think that's another factor to really think about when you're thinking about a potential solution.
Excellent. Thanks. So this idea of, well, then how do we move forward as we go from more complex to simplifying matters, or taking something complex and making it easier to do? What do we do? How do we look at it? So, one of the first steps is always, what's your situation from the technology, from those system complexities to your organizational maturity around Treasury? Are you a superintendent of payments, or are we provide bank services right now, and that's it? We barely can do that. So what's your situation? Where are you on the complexity factor? Where are you heading? What do you need? If you could get what you really needed, what would be needed today? What do you need in the near future? And then from that, this architectural drawing, this architectural flow is, what should your organization look like? Should it look like a hub? Have a hub that addresses this complexity? Or is it fine having several separate rails, just like you might have 3 phones on your desk, one for each person you call? Maybe that's acceptable to have 3 phones, but now that you've got 10 people to call, do you want a phone system that you can call? Do you need a hub? What does your architecture look like to get data back into those systems, to pull data out, to connect to the banks? We would then also say, what's your strategic partners? These could be advisors. These would be your technology partners. These would be your banks. How do you focus on who can provide solution sets that fit within your planned architecture? And then from there, it's making the business case. How do you justify the business case? Is it purely on efficiency? We can save money. We don't have to adjust 20 systems. That's certainly part of it, right? The return on investment, the cost of that. What about the ability to control? What's the danger if you lose money? Not just the loss of money, but loss of reputation. And we've seen that with organizations that make the news because somebody was able to use some deepfake technology and pull money or convince people to send money out of an organization. So how do we make the business case? We spoke a little bit about selecting partners and solutions that add value over time, that handle and reduce those other elements. So making that one decision that simplifies all of your future decision. And then, some of the final steps of implementing, testing the system, training users, and expanding that out as superintendent of payments, making sure everybody's using it and benefiting from those features. I went through a lot in just a few moments there. Mike, I'm sure you can add some comments to that.
Yeah, I just put a bit of a lens from from a vendor's perspective. So we get a large number of RFPs, and largely those are run through your procurement departments. Sometimes they have questionnaires with hundreds and hundreds of questions in them. And we don't, and because of the procurement rules that have been set, we don't have an opportunity to really understand your landscape, what's critical for you. And it's only when we get into a bit of a discussion do we start to learn that of what's really important. So might actually be 50 of the 300 questions that you actually asked, because most of them are aspirational, let's say. And so what I would just say is that when you're trying to work with a long-term technology partner and you're looking for a solution out there, I'd really encourage everybody to try and have discussions with them as you're going through the process. It might be a lot of meetings, but it really does help to make sure that you're being presented with the right solution, and that solution's being presented in a way that is specific to your needs rather than just completely generic. So the more time you sort of invest in potential partners that you're looking at and you're considering, the more benefit that will come back to you in making sure that you're selecting the right solution.
Thank you. Now we're to final thoughts. So Michael, why don't you kick us off on how people should think about proceeding as we summarize what we just covered?
Yeah, so be quick. As I said at the beginning, I think I said complexity isn't stagnant. It grows over time. Business changes, technology changes, new opportunities arise. For digital organizations, complexity can be handled in many cases much easier than in those decentralized organizations where a number of inconsistent processes and systems exist. So creating that right foundation is really key. For those who really the payment hub isn't necessarily a good fit for you now, I think it's important to understand what the future, what the technology and the benefit could be in the future as your future needs evolve, just so that you're thinking and considering that future state as you build out that enterprise architecture and your connectivity. Capturing the data is key. As I mentioned, if you have AI initiatives, right, this is going to be a key factor in enabling those opportunities. And then, thinking about the other processes that exist that are reliant on payments. So really, primarily everything around cash management should be considered as you think about complexity increasing and being able to continue to operate and gain that visibility. We spent a lot of time talking about fraud and controls. I think the treasurer's role is really about avoiding risk and mitigating risk where it can't be entirely avoided. So when it comes to payments, controls must be paramount for the organization. Where you have many different source systems, enforcing policies is difficult. The payment hub, it centralizes, it standardizes, and really democratizes the services that are available to each business unit around the globe. Craig, let me pass it to you. Maybe you cover the last couple.
Yeah, so are you in a position to scale as your organization growing, that you have to scale because of what you're doing? And then sustainability, are other changes being thrust upon your organization? And they are coming to essentially everyone. And one example is ISO 20022. So scalability and sustainability matter. And then evaluation, we just covered that on the prior few slides. Where are you? Where do you need to be? Evaluate those, the products, the solutions, the vendors in line with that. With that, I want to thank you, Michael, thank everyone else, and also turn it back over to Brian for just a real quick wrap up and another asset that you can have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Craig. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The CTP credits, today's webinar slides, and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you within 5 business days. And for more on cash management, be sure to download the new De-Risking Cash Management Technology Decisions ebook by clicking the link in the chat box. Thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.